Hi, I'm Dwayne Duggan, Remax Boulder Podcast. Today, our topic is contracts don't enforce themselves. And who better to have as a guest today for that topic is Jon Goodman from Frascona, Joyner, Goodman, and Greenstein. So Jon, thank you for being here today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Dwayne.
All right. Well, let's dive right into this topic. I think back to when I started in '78, the contracts were one page. It doesn't seem like there was a lot to enforce. Now there's 17 pages. So it's like you write this huge document, there's a problem. What we wanted to talk about today is what do we do when something goes wrong? So why don't we start from the seller's side? If you can give an example of a seller default and what might happen if a seller defaults on a particular item in a contract.
Sure, Dwayne. So one of the examples I can give you is when I bought the house that I live in right now. When I purchased that house, the seller was supposed to have cleared all their stuff out of the house naturally. And as my wife and I showed up with our moving van, etc., to move into the house, the seller had not cleared their things out.
Great. So as a buyer, what do you do? I mean, in the contract, it usually says if the blank was filled in, that there's a daily penalty if seller fails to deliver possession. In a lot of cases, it might be $100. In a big house, it might be $500 or $1,000. So how is that enforced?
Right. Well, the concept is it's not like an NFL football game where there's referees there and everything's videotaped, and if the seller defaults, somebody throws a flag, and then they're punished somehow. It doesn't happen real time.
So there's no contract enforcement police out there?
No, there are no contract enforcement police out there. If a default by a seller is big enough, then it's worthwhile for the buyer to hire a lawyer and file a lawsuit and invoke the power of the state through a lawsuit against the seller. But for small defaults like this, oftentimes there is not a practical remedy for the buyer. The buyer wants to move in, and the seller might not have any money, the seller might be upside down, it might have been a short sale, the seller might be filing bankruptcy in 3 days, and those penalty clauses don't mean anything unless the seller is, I shouldn't say they don't mean anything, but they're oftentimes not efficient to enforce unless the seller voluntarily is willing to pay the penalty. And in our case, we just did some horse trading with the seller, and my wife and I got a free rug out of it that we no longer have.
Right, so the bottom line, unless the particular clause in the contract is really a big deal, generally the realtor, buyers, and sellers tend to work things out, like maybe a 3 or 4 day possession or something like that. So
they do tend to work things out, but remember, I don't hear about the cases where they do tend to work things out, and I hear about the things where the seller, in this example that we just gave, is a horse's patootie. Not, by the way, in the case where I bought our house, and they don't work things out, and the buyer, who is the non-defaulting party, is frustrated because their lawyer is explaining to them that notwithstanding the ink on the page that talks about a $300 per day penalty, the buyer does not have a practical remedy against the seller.
right, okay.
Now, if the default is big enough, for example, the seller just refuses to close, that's a big deal. And that then might justify the buyer hiring a lawyer to bring the lawsuit to compel the seller to close.
And again, from the seller's side, our Colorado state contracts, it is specific performance. There's not a specified or a liquidated damages like the buyer's side, so.
Right, unless it's modified in additional provisions. The
Right.
pre-printed language of the Colorado contract gives the buyer the remedies of specific performance and damages against a seller.
Okay, all right. And so, any other thoughts on this, if the seller defaults, before we move on to the
No.
buyer? Okay, so if a buyer defaults, what's an example of a buyer defaulting on some term of the contract?
Something that's not unusual is oftentimes through no fault of the buyer, there's something that goes wrong with the loan process at the last minute. And so the lender does not give the clear to close signal, and there is not what we call good funds at the closing table, which would enable the buyer to close. While it may be through no fault of the buyer, it's also through no fault of the seller. And assuming that all the contingencies that would excuse the buyer from closing, like the loan objection contingency, have passed, the contract assigns that risk that the funds haven't come into the buyer. The buyer is in default. if the buyer can't close. So that gives the seller the freedom to walk away from the contract if they're so inclined. And sometimes the sellers are so inclined to walk away, especially in a hot market. But more often than not, this buyer is still the best bad option or flawed option for this seller.
Right.
And the seller will, on the one hand, feel like the seller has no option but to extend. But on the other hand, the buyer isn't putting up new money or other new considerations for that, and it is very frustrating for a seller when this happens.
Okay, and so from a buyer point of view, anything that a buyer could have their agent write into the contract to protect themselves, so like if they didn't get their clear to close on time, seller goes, it's a hot market, I've got 3 other backups, I'm gonna sell the backup number 2. Any clause that the buyer could put in their contract to avoid losing their home or their home purchase if the lender didn't come through in time?
Yes, the language could be written. A buyer could submit an offer with a clause that says essentially that if it's through no fault of the buyer, the seller is obligated to extend the contract for one time for not more than blank number of days. But there's no free lunch. If the offer is submitted with that clause in it, it makes the offer, all of the things being equal, less desirable for the seller, and that might cause the buyer to lose out against competing buyers. So as the buyer is submitting offers, the buyer has to make their own decision about how much risk they're willing to tolerate, and the broker that's working with the buyer and the buyer have to make their own guesses about how much competition there's going to be for this property.
So the market dictates maybe the quantity of protection clauses there might be in a buyer contract then?
That's correct.
Okay, all right. Any other thing that you can think of from the buyer side that would be helpful?
Well, remember, we moved away from the buyer side to the seller
Right.
side, and so the question that you meant to ask, I think, Dwayne, is there something a seller could do to protect themselves from a late default like that from the buyer? And first of all, there are already protections in the contract. The seller doesn't have to extend. The seller could condition the seller's extension on getting new money from the buyer. Perhaps the buyer would pay an extension fee. Perhaps the buyer would put up other additional earnest money. But there is not a bolt of lightning that strikes the buyer down because the buyer didn't close.
Okay, so again, in general, hopefully the realtors, the parties involved can work out the issue unless it gets big enough to the point that it warrants actually filing a lawsuit, which...
Yes, and I would imagine that most of the time they do work it out, and I never hear about this.
Right, you just get to hear about it once everybody's really butting
Right.
heads. And apparently you're quite good at solving those problems if they do get to that point, so...
And at least in my mind, I am.
Right, John, thank you very much for being here today. Appreciate you being here.
All right,
Thank you.
thanks, Dwayne.